James Mac McAllister wasn't much of a talker. To anyone watching, he was just an ordinary fisherman in a quiet coastal town, someone who preferred the rhythm of the waves to the noise of human chatter. Every morning, before the first light of dawn touched the water, Mac would row his small wooden boat into the bay. The oars dipped smoothly into the water, cutting through the calm surface with practiced ease. His movements were deliberate, almost methodical, like a man who knew exactly how to use his time. By mid-morning, he'd return with his catch, nothing fancy, just enough to sell to the local market and keep himself going. To the townsfolk, Mac was a simple man. Polite, sure, but distant. He wasn't the kind to linger in conversation or share stories over coffee at the diner. He'd nod politely at a greeting, maybe offer a small smile, but his words were always brief. Most assumed he preferred it that way. "Mac's a man of few words," old Mrs. Henshaw liked to say as she watched him unload his nets from her front porch. Nothing wrong with that. Not everyone has to be a talker. Yet, beneath his weathered hat and quiet demeanor was a man few could truly understand. The townsfolk didn't know much about his past, and Mac wasn't in the habit of sharing. The few who'd tried to pry quickly gave up when they realized he wasn't forthcoming. There were whispers, of course. Small-town gossip had its way of filling in the gaps. Some said Mac had come to the town to escape a broken marriage. Others believed he was hiding from something, a debt, a mistake, or maybe even the law. But none of the theories stuck for long because Mac didn't fit the mold of a desperate man. He was calm, steady, and reliable. If someone's boat needed fixing or a stray dog needed care, Mac was the first to step up. It didn't matter that he never stayed long enough to chat or that he never joined the town's social events. The truth, though, was far more complicated. Mac had lived more lives than most of the people in that town could imagine. Before the fishing nets and quiet mornings, his hands had dismantled bombs in the heat of foreign deserts. Before the gentle lapping of waves against his boat, his ears had been tuned to the crackle of radio commands and the distant rumble of danger. He had spent years as a Navy SEAL, moving through some of the most dangerous places in the world. His sharp eyes, now scanning the bay for signs of fish, had once spotted threats miles away. But that life was behind him now, or so he thought. Mac had come to this sleepy harbor town hoping for peace. He liked the simplicity of it all, the small boats bobbing on the water, the salty air, the friendly but unobtrusive townsfolk. It was a place where people let you be, as long as you pulled your weight. And Mac, with his steady work and unassuming presence, fit right in. But trouble has a way of finding people, even those who would rather avoid it. The day the bikers rolled into town was like any other. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the docks. Seagulls squawked lazily overhead, and the scent of salt and fish filled the air. Mac was unloading his morning catch, his hands moving efficiently as he transferred the slippery fish into crates. His boat rocked gently against the dock as he worked, the rhythm almost soothing. That's when the sound of engines shattered the calm. It started as a distant growl, low and rumbling, like thunder rolling in from the horizon. The sound grew louder and louder until it seemed to vibrate in the very air. Heads turned as a line of motorcycles roared down Main Street, their chrome gleaming in the sunlight. The riders, dressed in leather jackets and dark sunglasses, looked as out of place in the quiet town as wolves in a sheep meadow. The townsfolk watched warily as the bikers pulled up near the docks. There were 6 of them, each one larger and meaner looking than the last. They dismounted their bikes with an air of practiced arrogance, their boots thudding heavily against the wooden planks of the dock. One of them, a hulking man with a dragon tattoo curling up his neck, spotted Mac unloading his crates. He nudged the man next to him and smirked. "Hey, look at this guy," the tattooed biker said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Out here playing fisherman, huh? Catch anything worth keeping, old man?" Mac didn't respond. He kept his head down, focused on his work. The biker didn't like being ignored. He sauntered closer, his boots echoing against the dock. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, his tone sharper now. Mac glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable. He gave a small nod and returned to his task, stacking the last crate onto the dock. The biker frowned, clearly unimpressed. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue," he taunted, his friends chuckling behind him. Mac straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. He met the biker's gaze for a moment, his sharp blue eyes calm but piercing. Then, without a word, he turned to secure his boat. The tattooed biker's smirk twisted into a scowl. "This guy think he's too good to talk to us," he said to his friends, his voice loud and mocking. The others joined in, their laughter grating against the peaceful backdrop of the harbor. A couple of locals lingered nearby, their eyes darting nervously between Mac and the bikers. No one stepped forward. It wasn't their business, and besides, the bikers looked like trouble. The leader stepped even closer to Mac, invading his space. "You deaf or just stupid?" he sneered. "Maybe I should teach you some manners." Mac didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or posture aggressively. He simply looked at the man, his calm gaze unyielding. "I'm just trying to do my work," he said evenly, his voice low but firm. The leader laughed, but it was an uneasy sound. Something about Mac's quiet confidence seemed to unsettle him, though he wouldn't admit it. "Yeah, well, maybe you should try a little harder to show some respect," he said, his tone harsher now. He reached out and shoved Mac's shoulder, hard enough to make him take a step back. The dock went silent. Even the seagulls seemed to pause, their cries fading into the background. The locals watching held their breath, their eyes widening in anticipation. Mac stood still for a moment, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, closing the distance between him and the biker. He looked up at the taller man, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly. The leader hesitated, just for a second. There was something in Mac's tone, something cold and unyielding that gave him pause. But his pride wouldn't let him back down, not in front of his crew. "Oh, I think I do," the biker said, his voice dripping with bravado. Mac sighed, almost as if he were disappointed. He glanced briefly at the group of bikers, then back at their leader. His eyes, steady and sharp, seemed to take in everything: their stances, their movements, the way they held themselves. The townsfolk watching didn't know it, but Mac was already preparing. Years of training had taught him how to assess a threat in seconds, how to calculate the odds and act decisively. And while he had hoped to leave that part of his life behind, it seemed fate had other plans. The standoff between Mac and the tattooed biker stretched out in silence, broken only by the faint sound of waves lapping against the dock. For a moment, it seemed as though nothing would happen. Maybe the biker would walk away. Maybe Mac's calm, unflinching presence would defuse the situation. But then the leader barked a sharp laugh, turning to his crew. "You see this guy? Thinks he's some kinda tough guy, huh?" He jabbed a finger toward Mac, his smirk returning. "Bet he's never been in a real fight in his life." The others laughed, eager to back up their leader. One of them, a wiry man with a scar cutting across his cheek, spoke up, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe he's a yoga instructor or something. All that deep breathing and inner peace. Hey, old man, wanna show us some moves?" Mac didn't reply. He was still, almost unnaturally so, his body relaxed yet perfectly balanced. His eyes stayed on the leader, calm but focused, like a hawk sizing up its prey. The leader leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. "What's the matter, old man? You scared? You gonna cry?" Mac tilted his head slightly, studying the man. Then, with the barest hint of a smile, he said, "You don't scare me." The biker's face darkened, his smirk vanishing in an instant. He shoved Mac again, harder this time, causing him to stumble back a step. The locals watching flinched, their unease palpable. "Enough," a voice called from the small crowd. It was the harbor master, an older man named Gus who had run the docks for decades. Gus stepped forward, his expression grim. "This is a peaceful town. We don't want any trouble here." The leader shot Gus a look of pure disdain. "Mind your own business, old man. This doesn't concern you." Gus didn't back down. "You're on my dock, so it does concern me. Leave him alone and move along. We don't need your kind stirring up problems." For a moment, the leader looked like he might lash out at Gus. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched. But then he caught the look in Mac's eyes, a look so calm and steady it was almost unnerving. Something about Mac's demeanor made the biker hesitate, though he wouldn't admit it. "Fine," the leader spat, turning away with a scowl. He motioned to his crew. "Let's get out of here. This place is a dump anyway." The bikers climbed back onto their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life. The leader glared at Mac one last time, his eyes filled with unspoken threats. "This ain't over, old man," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We'll be back." Mac watched silently as the bikers roared away, their engines echoing down the street until the sound finally faded into the distance. The tension on the dock eased, and the townsfolk began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. A few cast curious glances at Mac, wondering how he'd stayed so calm in the face of such blatant aggression. Gus approached him, his weathered face lined with concern. "You all right, Mac?" Mac nodded. "I'm fine." "You handled that well," Gus said. "But those guys, they're trouble. They've been through here before, stirring up fights and causing damage. You'd best watch your back." Mac gave a small shrug. "I can handle myself." Gus frowned but didn't press the issue. He'd known Mac long enough to recognize when a man didn't want to talk. "Well, if you need anything, you let me know," he said before turning back to his work. Mac finished loading his crates into his truck, his movements steady and unhurried. But beneath his calm exterior, his mind was racing. He had hoped his days of dealing with conflict were over. He had chosen this quiet town, this simple life, to escape the chaos of his past. Yet trouble had found him anyway. As he drove home, the events of the morning played over in his mind. He could tell the leader of the bikers wasn't the type to let things go. The man had pride, and Mac had challenged it, however unintentionally. It was only a matter of time before they crossed paths again. Mac's house was a modest cabin tucked away on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and overlooking the bay. It was quiet, just the way he liked it. He parked his truck in the gravel driveway and unloaded the crates of fish, carrying them to the small shed where he cleaned and stored his catch. The work was repetitive and soothing, a welcome distraction from the morning's events. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to his past, a past he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Years ago, Mac had been a Navy SEAL, part of an elite team that carried out missions most people couldn't even imagine. He had seen things, done things, that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When he finally left the military, he swore he would never pick up a weapon again. He wanted peace, not violence. But the skills he had learned, the discipline, the focus, the ability to assess a situation and react in an instant, those things never left him. They were a part of him, ingrained in his very being. He finished cleaning the fish and rinsed his hands in the sink, the cold water shocking him back to the present. He dried his hands and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp sea air. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the water. It was a beautiful evening, peaceful and calm. But Mac couldn't shake the feeling that the peace wouldn't last. The bikers didn't wait long to make good on their leader's threat. The very next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the roar of motorcycle engines shattered the quiet once again. This time, they didn't stop at the docks. They rode through town, their engines revving loudly, drawing attention wherever they went. They stopped in front of the diner, where locals were gathered for dinner. The leader dismounted first, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. His crew followed, their presence menacing. Inside the diner, the townsfolk watched nervously as the bikers strutted toward the door. The bell above the entrance jingled as they pushed inside, their loud laughter filling the small space. The leader approached the counter, leaning casually against it. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said to the waitress, his tone mocking. "How about getting me a coffee? On the house, of course." The waitress, a young woman named Sarah, hesitated, glancing toward the owner of the diner, an older man named Joe. Joe gave her a small nod, his face tense. "Coming right up," Sarah said, forcing a smile as she reached for a mug. The leader smirked, clearly enjoying the tension in the room. He turned to his crew. "This place ain't so bad," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Might stick around for a while, see what kind of fun we can have." Mac was sitting at a corner table, quietly eating his dinner. He had come into town for a rare meal out, hoping to enjoy a quiet evening. But the moment the bikers walked in, he knew it wouldn't be quiet for long. He kept his head down, hoping they wouldn't notice him. But luck wasn't on his side. The leader's eyes landed on Mac, and his smirk widened. Well, he said, pushing off the counter. "If it isn't the old fisherman." The diner fell silent as the leader approached Mac's table, his crew trailing behind him. "Didn't think we'd see you again so soon," the leader said, his tone mocking. "What's the matter? Run out of fish to catch?" Mac looked up slowly, meeting the man's gaze. "Just trying to enjoy my dinner," he said evenly. The leader chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You hear that, boys? He's trying to enjoy his dinner. Maybe we should join him." The bikers laughed as they pulled up chairs, crowding around Mac's table. The leader leaned in close, his voice low and threatening. "You embarrassed me yesterday, old man. Made me look weak in front of my crew. Now, I don't take kindly to that." Mac's expression didn't change. He picked up his fork and took another bite of his food, chewing slowly. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," he said after a moment. "I was just doing my job." The leader's jaw tightened, and his hand shot out, grabbing Mac's plate and tossing it onto the floor. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the diner. "You think you're funny," the leader growled, his face inches from Mac's. Mac sighed, his patience wearing thin. He looked around the diner, noting the fear in the faces of the other patrons. He didn't want a fight, not here, not now. But he also knew that walking away wouldn't solve the problem. "You need to leave," Mac said quietly, his voice firm. The leader's eyes widened in disbelief. Then he laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Or what?" he sneered. "What are you gonna do about it?" Mac leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You really don't want to find out?" The bait shop was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The chipped wooden counter, jars of pickled bait on the shelves, and the faint, salty scent of the sea gave it a rustic charm. Locals stopped by for supplies, chatted about the weather, and left with their fishing lines and a sense of calm. It wasn't a place for trouble not until the bikers arrived. The sound of their motorcycles echoed down the quiet harbor road, their engines roaring like an approaching storm. Locals paused mid-conversation, turning their heads toward the noise. By the time the bikers parked outside the bait shop, the once peaceful air had turned uneasy. There were 5 of them, all dressed in leather jackets adorned with patches and insignias. They moved with a swagger, their boots stomping heavily against the wooden planks of the dock. Their laughter was loud and brash, cutting through the tranquil morning like a knife. Inside the shop, the owner, old Mr. Grady, looked up from the counter. He adjusted his glasses, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he noticed the group. "Morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice cautious but polite. The leader of the bikers, a towering man with a thick beard and a dragon tattoo spiraling up his neck, leaned against the counter with a smirk. "Morning, old-timer," he said, dragging out the words. "Heard this place sells the best bait in town. That true?" Grady nodded, his throat bobbing as he swallowed nervously. "Why yes, sir. Got fresh squid, minnows, worms, whatever you need." The leader chuckled, reaching for a jar of bait on the shelf. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting it like he was sizing up something worthless. "This it?" he asked mockingly, holding the jar up to his crew. "This what the big, bad fishermen around here use?" The others laughed, one of them slapping the jar out of his hand. It hit the floor with a thud, rolling to a stop near the door. Grady flinched but didn't say anything, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Oops," the leader said, his tone dripping with fake remorse. "Guess I'm a little clumsy." The laughter continued as they made their way out of the shop, leaving Grady pale and shaken. But the real target of their attention wasn't the bait shop or its owner, it was James Mac McAllister, who was unloading his morning catch a few yards away. Mac had just finished stacking the last of his crates on the dock when he heard them. He didn't look up, didn't react. He simply wiped his hands on a rag and began inspecting his nets for repairs. The leader spotted him first. He stopped in his tracks, his smirk widening as he motioned for his crew to follow. "Well, look who we've got here," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the dock. Mac glanced at them briefly, his expression unreadable, and then went back to his work. "Hey, old man," the leader called, striding closer. "Catch anything worth bragging about? Or you just out here playing fisherman?" Mac didn't respond. He knelt beside his crate, adjusting the lid and securing it with twine. The leader's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. He didn't like being ignored. "Hey," he barked, his voice sharper now. "I'm talking to you." The other bikers circled around Mac, their boots scraping against the wooden dock. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, leaned forward. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Got nothing to say? Or maybe you're just too good to talk to us?" Mac straightened up slowly, turning to face them. His eyes flicked over the group, calm and calculating, before he spoke. "I'm busy," he said simply, his tone even. The leader snorted. "Busy? Doing what? Pretending you're some kind of sea captain?" He stepped closer, his shadow falling over Mac. "You think you're better than us, huh?" Mac didn't rise to the bait. He turned back to his nets, his movements steady and unhurried. That only made the bikers angrier. "Look at this guy," one of them said, nudging the wiry man beside him. "Thinks he's too good to give us the time of day. Maybe he needs a little reminder of who's in charge around here," the scar-faced biker sneered. The leader stepped even closer, his boots inches from Mac's crate. "Listen here, old man," he said, his voice low and threatening. "We don't take kindly to disrespect. So how about you show us a little hospitality?" Mac didn't flinch. He didn't step back or look away. Instead, he met the leader's gaze head-on, his expression as steady as the tide. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said quietly. The leader chuckled darkly, his lips curling into a sneer. "Well, maybe trouble's looking for you." The tension on the dock was thick enough to cut with a knife. A few townsfolk had gathered nearby, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and fear. One of the bikers, a stocky man with a buzz cut, reached out and grabbed the edge of Mac's crate, yanking it open. Fish spilled onto the dock, their silver scales glinting in the sunlight. "Oops," Buzzcut said with a smirk. "Guess I'm clumsy too." Mac's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. He bent down and began picking up the fish, placing them back into the crate one by one. "Oh, come on," Scarface jeered. "You're just gonna take that? Where's your backbone, old man?" The leader crouched down beside Mac, watching him with a mocking grin. "You know, I almost feel bad for you," he said. "Out here all alone, no one to back you up. Must get pretty lonely, huh?" Mac didn't respond. He kept working, his focus unwavering. That only seemed to infuriate the bikers more. Buzzcut stepped forward, kicking the crate so hard it slid across the dock, scattering the fish again. The crowd gasped, and someone called out, "Hey, that's enough." It was Gus, the harbor master, his weathered face set in a scowl as he approached. "You leave him alone," he said, his voice firm. "This is a peaceful town. We don't want any trouble here." The leader stood up, towering over Gus. "And who's gonna stop us?" "You." He laughed, the sound cruel and mocking. Gus didn't back down. "You're not welcome here," he said. "Now get back on your bikes and leave." The leader's smirk faltered for a moment, but then he caught sight of Mac, who was now standing, his eyes locked on the leader. Mac's gaze was calm but piercing, the kind of look that made people uneasy without knowing why. The leader hesitated, his bravado wavering just slightly. But he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You got lucky today, old man," he said, stepping back. "But don't think this is over." With that, he motioned for his crew to follow, and they walked away, their laughter fading as they mounted their bikes and roared off down the road. The tension on the dock eased, but the damage was done. Locals murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Gus approached Mac, his expression a mix of concern and admiration. "You all right?" Mac nodded. "I'm fine." "You handled that better than most," Gus said. "But those guys, they're not the kind to let things go." Mac didn't reply. He picked up the scattered fish, placing them back into the crate with quiet efficiency. As Gus walked away, Mac straightened up, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. He had chosen this town for its peace and simplicity, but now it seemed that peace was slipping away. Deep down, he knew the bikers would be back. And next time, they wouldn't just be looking for trouble, they'd be bringing it. The dock grew quiet after the bikers left, but the uneasy energy they'd stirred lingered. The townsfolk slowly returned to their routines, exchanging whispered comments as they passed by Mac. He could feel their eyes on him, a mix of sympathy and curiosity. But he ignored it, as he always did. He had learned a long time ago that attention only made trouble worse. By the time Mac finished cleaning up the mess, the sun was high in the sky, and the dock was almost empty. He loaded the last crate onto his truck and headed home. The drive was short, but the winding coastal road gave him time to think. He wasn't angry. He rarely got angry anymore. What was the point? But something about the bikers bothered him. It wasn't just their arrogance or their disrespect. It was the way the leader had looked at him, like he was trying to size him up. Mac knew that look. He'd seen it countless times before in interrogation rooms, on missions, and sometimes in the mirror. It was the look of someone who wanted to dominate, to prove something, no matter the cost. When he reached his small house on the edge of town, Mac parked the truck and unloaded his gear. His home was simple but well kept, with a porch overlooking the bay. Inside, everything was neat and organized, each item in its place. It was a stark contrast to the chaos he'd known during his years in the Navy. After storing his catch in the freezer, Mac sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He stared out the window, his mind replaying the events of the morning. He had no intention of escalating the situation. The bikers were probably just passing through, stirring up trouble wherever they went. If he ignored them, they'd likely move on. But something about Gus's words stuck with him, they're not the kind to let things go. Mac sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't want trouble, but he also knew that trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he ran from it. The next few days passed without incident, but the tension in the air didn't fade. The bikers were still in town, their motorcycles often spotted outside the local bar or rumbling down the quiet streets. Mac kept his distance, going about his routine as usual. He spent his mornings fishing, his afternoons repairing his boat, and his evenings watching the sunset over the bay. It was a simple life, and he intended to keep it that way. But the bikers weren't interested in simplicity. One evening, as Mac was unloading his catch at the dock, he noticed a group of locals gathered near the bait shop. Their voices were hushed, but their expressions were tense. "What's going on?" Mac asked, approaching Gus, who was standing near the crowd. Gus glanced at him, his face grim. "Those bikers," he said. "They've been causing all kinds of trouble. Harassing folks, starting fights at the bar, and now this." He gestured toward the side of the bait shop, where someone had spray-painted crude graffiti in bold, red letters. It read, "This town belongs to us." Mac's jaw tightened. "When did this happen?" "Sometime last night," Gus said. "Nobody saw anything, but we all know who's behind it." Mac nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the dock. "Did you call the sheriff?" "Yeah," Gus said. "But you know how it is. By the time he gets here, they'll be long gone. And even if he does catch them, what's he gonna do? They're not scared of the law." Mac didn't say anything, but his mind was already working. He didn't like bullies, especially ones who thought they could terrorize a quiet town without consequences. As he walked back to his truck, Mac felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had tried to leave that part of his life behind, to trade danger and violence for peace and solitude. But some things couldn't be ignored. It wasn't long before the bikers crossed paths with Mac again. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the harbor in shades of orange and gold. Mac was at the dock, cleaning his nets, when he heard the roar of engines. He looked up and saw the bikers pulling into the parking lot, their motorcycles kicking up dust as they came to a stop. The leader dismounted first, his dragon tattoo glinting in the fading light. The others followed, their expressions smug and predatory. Mac didn't move. He didn't need to. The leader sauntered over, his boots thudding against the wooden planks. Well, he said, spreading his arms wide. "If it isn't our favorite fisherman." Mac kept his eyes on his nets, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, his tone calm. The leader chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Yeah, actually. We were thinking, this dock is looking a little empty. How about you let us borrow it for a while? You know, for our bikes." Mac paused, glancing up at him. "This dock's for fishermen, not bikes." The leader's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "That's so." Mac nodded, his gaze steady. "That's so." The other bikers stepped closer, their postures tense. One of them, Scarface, cracked his knuckles. "I think this guy needs a lesson in sharing," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Mac stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He wasn't a big man, not compared to the bikers, but there was something about the way he carried himself calm, composed, and unshakable that made even the boldest men think twice. "I'm not looking for a fight," Mac said evenly. The leader smirked. "Good, because you wouldn't win." Mac didn't respond. He simply looked at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the leader seemed unsure. But then his smirk returned, and he gestured to his crew. "Let's show him what happens to guys who don't know their place." Scarface lunged forward, his fist swinging toward Mac's face. What happened next was so fast that the bikers barely saw it. Mac stepped aside, his movements fluid and precise. He caught Scarface's wrist, twisting it just enough to make him yelp in pain, and then pushed him back with a controlled shove. The biker stumbled, clutching his arm, his face a mix of anger and shock. The leader's smirk vanished. "You've got some nerve," he growled, stepping closer. Mac raised a hand, his posture relaxed but alert. "You don't want to do this," he said. The leader hesitated, his eyes darting to his crew. They looked back at him, unsure. For a moment, the dock was silent, the only sound the distant cry of seagulls. Finally, the leader sneered. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You'll regret this, old man." With that, he turned and walked away, his crew following reluctantly. As the roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance, Mac exhaled slowly. He knew this was just the beginning. The dock fell silent as Mac's words lingered in the air. The leader of the bikers, the man with the dragon tattoo, stared at him for a moment, then barked out a laugh that echoed across the harbor. "This guy thinks he's some kind of tough guy," the leader mocked, his grin wide as he gestured to his crew. The others laughed along, their jeers blending with the restless hum of the wind. But Mac didn't flinch, didn't blink. He stood steady, his feet firmly planted on the weathered wood of the dock. The waves lapped gently against the pilings, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. The leader grabbed Mac's shirt again, his sneer tightening. "You've got guts, old man. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." The crowd of locals had grown larger now, their whispers filling the air. Some looked concerned, while others shook their heads, muttering that Mac should just walk away. But Mac wasn't moving. "Let me ask you something," Mac said evenly, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the leader pause. "Do you know what this means?" He shifted slightly, raising his arm to reveal the tattoo on his forearm, a trident surrounded by stars, inked in crisp, dark lines. It was an unassuming design at first glance, but its meaning was unmistakable to those who knew. The leader squinted at it, his expression turning from smug to curious. "What, that's some kind of old sailor thing," he said, his tone dismissive. Mac's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "Something like that." One of the bikers, a wiry man with sunken eyes, stopped laughing. His gaze flicked to the tattoo, and then to Mac's face. Something shifted in his expression, unease, maybe even fear. "Boss," the wiry man muttered, stepping closer to the leader. "That's a seal tattoo." The words hung in the air like a spark waiting to catch fire. The leader turned to his crew member, his brow furrowed. "A what?" "A Navy SEAL," the man explained, his voice dropping lower. "You know, the guys they call when everything's gone to hell. Special Forces. Badasses. And this guy," he glanced at Mac again, swallowing hard. "He might be one of them." The leader scoffed, though his bravado faltered for a split second. "You're kidding me, right? Look at him. He's just some washed-up fisherman." But Mac saw the doubt creeping into the man's eyes. He didn't say a word, letting the silence stretch out, letting the leader wrestle with the possibility. The wiry biker stepped back, shaking his head. "I'm just saying, man. We might want to think about this." "Shut up," the leader snapped, though his grip on Mac's shirt loosened slightly. The crowd of onlookers grew bolder as the tension stretched out. Someone in the back muttered, "Maybe they should leave him alone." Another chimed in, "He hasn't done anything to them." The bikers turned to glare at the townsfolk, and the murmurs died down. But the brief distraction was all Mac needed. In a single, fluid motion, he pulled the leader's hand off his shirt and stepped back, creating just enough space between them. The leader stumbled slightly, his surprise quickly turning to anger. "You think you're clever, old man," he spat, his voice rising. You're just begging for a beating. Mac tilted his head, his expression calm, almost curious. You sure about that? The leader lunged forward, throwing a wild punch aimed at Mac's jaw. But Mac moved like water, his body twisting effortlessly out of the way. The punch sailed harmlessly past, and the leader's momentum carried him forward, making him stumble. Before he could recover, Mac stepped in and grabbed his wrist, twisting it with precise, controlled force. The leader let out a sharp yelp of pain, dropping to one knee. Mac released him just as quickly, letting the man fall back onto the dock. You're fast, Mac said, his tone almost conversational. But you're sloppy. The bikers stared in stunned silence, their confidence shaken. The wiry biker, the one who had recognized the tattoo, spoke up again. Boss, I'm telling you, let's just go. This guy's not worth it. But the leader wasn't listening. His pride was wounded, and his anger burned hotter with every passing second. He scrambled to his feet, his face red with fury. You think you're tough, he snarled, his voice shaking. You're dead, old man. You hear me? Dead. Mac's expression didn't change. You've got a lot of fight in you, he said, his voice steady. But you don't know what you're up against. The leader lunged again, but this time, Mac didn't wait for him to close the distance. He moved first, stepping into the man's space and deflecting his attack with a calculated strike to his forearm. The leader's arm buckled, and Mac followed through with a quick sweep of his leg, sending him sprawling onto the dock again. The bikers took a collective step back, their earlier confidence now replaced with hesitation. Mac straightened, adjusting his jacket as if nothing had happened. Walk away, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. This is your chance. The crowd watching from a distance began to murmur again, this time in hushed tones of awe. Some of the older locals exchanged knowing glances, remembering bits and pieces of Mac's past that had long been whispered about but never confirmed. Gus, standing near the bait shop, shook his head with a faint smile. I told you, he muttered to no one in particular. Mac's not a man you want to mess with. The leader of the bikers climbed to his feet again, his movements slower this time. He glared at Mac, his hands clenched into fists, but the fear in his eyes was impossible to miss. You think this is over, he spat, his voice trembling. You don't know who you're messing with. Mac raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. Funny, he said. I was about to say the same thing. As the bikers retreated, their engines roaring to life, the townsfolk began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with excitement and speculation. But Mac didn't stick around to bask in the attention. He quietly gathered his scattered gear, loading it into his truck with the same steady efficiency as always. Before he left, Gus approached him, his expression equal parts admiration and concern. You all right? Gus asked, his voice low. Mac nodded. I'm fine. Gus hesitated, then added, you didn't have to hold back, you know. Nobody here would have blamed you if you'd gone all out. Mac paused, his hands resting on the edge of his truck bed. It's not about what they'd blame me for, he said quietly. It's about what I'd blame myself for. Gus nodded slowly, understanding the weight of those words. Still, he said, you've got a way of handling things that most folks around here can't even imagine. Mac didn't respond. He climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life, and drove away without another word. But as he disappeared down the road, Gus couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet fisherman had only shown a fraction of what he was capable of. Mac's truck disappeared around the bend, leaving a cloud of dust behind. The townsfolk slowly trickled back to their routines, their conversations buzzing with speculation. Did you see how fast he moved? One of the older men at the dock muttered. And that tattoo? Another replied, shaking his head. I always thought it was just some fishing thing. Never imagined. Gus lingered by the bait shop, his eyes narrowing as he watched the bikers regroup near their roaring motorcycles. They were shaken, that much was clear, but the anger hadn't left their eyes. The leader, still rubbing his wrist where Mac had twisted it, spat on the ground. "This isn't over," he growled to his crew. His wiry companion hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the road Mac had taken. "Boss, I'm telling you, we should just leave it. That guy, he's not normal." The leader's pride flared again. "He's a washed-up old man," he snapped, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the others. "I don't care if he's some hotshot soldier or whatever. Nobody makes a fool out of me." The wiry biker bit his lip but said nothing more. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the bikers holed up in the town's only bar, a dimly lit dive called the Rusty Anchor. Their voices carried across the empty streets, slurred with alcohol and tinged with frustration. "We need to send a message," the leader said, slamming his beer bottle onto the sticky wooden table. "If we let this guy walk all over us, everyone's gonna think we're a joke." "Yeah, but..." one of the younger bikers started, his voice uncertain. "What if he really is, one of those SEAL guys? I mean, you saw how he handled you." The leader's glare silenced him. "So what? He's one guy. There's 6 of us. You think he can take us all on?" The others exchanged glances, the memory of Mac's calm, unshaken demeanor still fresh in their minds. But the leader's confidence, or maybe his desperation, was contagious, and one by one, they nodded. "All right," the wiry biker said finally, though his tone was reluctant. "But we need to be smart about it. Catch him off guard." The leader grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light. "Exactly. We'll wait till tonight. He's probably holed up in some little shack, all alone. We'll pay him a visit, show him what happens when you mess with us." Mac's house was a modest cabin nestled at the edge of the woods, overlooking the bay. The sun had set, casting a golden glow over the water as he sat on his porch, cleaning his fishing knife. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone filled the air, blending with the distant sounds of waves and the occasional cry of a seagull. He wasn't surprised by what had happened that afternoon. Men like the bikers, arrogant, brash, and easily provoked, were nothing new to him. He'd encountered their kind in bars, in alleys, and on battlefields far from home. But something in the leader's eyes had told Mac this wasn't over. The man's pride had been wounded, and men like that didn't let things go easily. Mac glanced at the tattoo on his forearm, running his thumb over the inked lines. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a reminder of the life he'd left behind, a life filled with danger, discipline, and decisions that had weighed heavily on his soul. He stood, his movements deliberate, and walked inside. The cabin was sparse but orderly, every item in its place. A few framed photos hung on the walls, images of Mac in uniform, surrounded by his team. In one, a much younger Mac stood beside a man with a broad grin and sharp eyes, both of them holding tridents. Mac's gaze lingered on the photo for a moment before he turned away. He opened a small, locked chest in the corner of the room and pulled out a worn duffel bag. Inside were a few tools of his trade, items he hadn't touched in years but had never been able to part with. He placed the bag on the table, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, the bikers were gearing up. Under the cover of darkness, they rode out toward Mac's cabin, their headlights slicing through the night. The roar of their engines echoed through the quiet town, causing curtains to twitch and lights to flicker on in the surrounding homes. "Think he'll be ready for us?" one of the younger bikers asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. The leader smirked. "Doesn't matter. We'll overwhelm him before he even knows what's happening." But the wiry biker wasn't so sure. His eyes scanned the shadows as they rode, a nagging sense of unease settling in his chest. The group reached the edge of the woods and killed their engines, dismounting their bikes. The leader motioned for them to spread out, his voice a harsh whisper. Keep quiet. Surround the place. We move on my signal. They crept through the trees, their boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves. The cabin came into view, its windows glowing faintly with the light of a single lamp inside. Inside the cabin, Mac sat at the table, his knife still in hand. He'd heard the rumble of their bikes long before they'd killed the engines. He'd seen the faint glint of their headlights through the trees. He wasn't surprised. Standing, he moved to the window and glanced out, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. The bikers thought they were being stealthy, but to Mac, their movements were as loud as fireworks. He turned back to the table and picked up the duffel bag. Slowly, he began to unzip it, revealing its contents. Outside, the leader signaled to his crew, motioning for them to move closer. The bikers crept forward, their weapons a mix of chains, bats, and knives clutched tightly in their hands. The leader reached the porch first, his boots creaking on the wooden steps. He turned to his crew, grinning. "This is gonna be easy," he whispered. But as his hand reached for the doorknob, the door swung open. Mac stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the warm light inside. His expression was calm, his stance relaxed, but there was a weight to his presence that made the leader hesitate. "You shouldn't have come here," Mac said, his voice low but firm. The leader recovered quickly, sneering. "Big talk for a guy who's outnumbered." Mac tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Am I?" Before the leader could respond, a loud snap echoed through the woods, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing to the ground. The bikers froze, their eyes darting around in the darkness. "What was that?" one of them hissed. Mac didn't answer. He just stepped back into the cabin, leaving the door wide open. The leader's bravado faltered, but he motioned for his crew to follow him inside. "Come on. Don't let him scare you." But as they stepped over the threshold, they had no idea the trap they were walking into or the full extent of who they were dealing with. The leader's knees scraped against the rough wood of the dock as Mac maintained his unyielding grip on the man's twisted arm. Around them, the night was eerily still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The only sounds were the groans of the leader and the faint rustle of the sea breeze. All right," the leader gritted out, his voice strained with pain and humiliation. "Let me go." Mac leaned in close, his voice low and steady. "Lesson 2, he murmured, tightening his hold just enough to make the man wince. "When someone tells you to walk away, you listen." Mac released the man abruptly, letting him collapse onto the dock in a heap. The leader cradled his arm, glaring up at Mac with a mix of fury and fear. "What are you waiting for?" the wiry biker hissed at the others. "Get him." The remaining bikers hesitated, but the leader barked, "Do it," spurred by wounded pride rather than logic. The first biker lunged, a rusted chain swinging in a wide arc. Mac sidestepped effortlessly, his movements smooth and controlled. With a sharp twist of his wrist, he grabbed the chain mid-swing and yanked, pulling the man off balance. One quick motion, a subtle pivot and a precise shove sent the biker tumbling to the ground, his weapon clattering uselessly beside him. Before the others could react, Mac had already closed the gap. The second man swung a bat, aiming for Mac's ribs. But Mac was faster. He ducked low, the wooden bat whistling harmlessly over his head. With a sharp jab to the man's midsection, Mac knocked the air out of him. A quick sweep of his leg sent the man sprawling onto the dock. The wiry biker hung back, his eyes wide with disbelief. What is this guy?" he muttered, his voice trembling. The answer was in Mac's every move. Each motion was deliberate, each strike precise. He wasn't just fighting, he was dismantling his opponents, one by one, with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years mastering the art of survival. As the final two bikers circled him warily, Mac's calm demeanor remained unchanged. He straightened, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve, and locked eyes with the wiry one. "You know what this is," Mac said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the full tattoo on his forearm, a trident piercing through waves, encircled by stars. The wiry biker's face paled. That's the SEAL insignia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The leader, still hunched on the dock, sneered. "So what if he's military? He's just one guy." Mac took a slow step forward, his gaze like steel. "I'm not just military," he said, his tone measured but heavy with meaning. "I'm a SEAL. And I don't take kindly to threats." The leader faltered, his bravado finally cracking. "Why you bluffing?" he stammered, though the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. Mac's lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. "Bluffing," he repeated. Then, with a speed that defied belief, he moved again. The wiry biker tried to run, but Mac was faster. In 3 strides, he closed the distance, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it just enough to immobilize him without causing permanent damage. A sharp shove sent the wiry man stumbling into the leader, the two of them collapsing in a heap. The final biker hesitated, his knuckles white around the handle of a crowbar. But Mac didn't give him a chance. With a swift kick, he sent the crowbar flying from the man's grip. A moment later, the biker was on the ground, clutching his leg and groaning in pain. Mac stood in the center of the chaos, his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. Around him, the bikers lay sprawled, their weapons scattered like discarded toys. "Lesson 3, Mac said, his voice carrying over the groans of his defeated opponents. "Strength isn't about how many people you have. It's about knowing how to handle yourself." The leader struggled to his feet, his face flushed with a mix of humiliation and rage. "You think you're so tough," he spat, his voice cracking. "You got lucky, old man. Next time." "There won't be a next time," Mac interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He stepped closer, his presence towering despite his unassuming frame. "Because if there is, you'll regret it. Understand?" The leader opened his mouth to retort, but the look in Mac's eyes silenced him. It wasn't anger or hostility. It was something colder, something far more unsettling, absolute confidence. "Why yeah," the leader muttered, his bravado reduced to ashes. "We're leaving." He turned to his crew, gesturing for them to gather their weapons and limp back to their bikes. One by one, they obeyed, their earlier arrogance replaced with quiet humiliation. As the bikers roared away into the night, the townsfolk began to emerge from their homes, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. Gus approached Mac cautiously, his voice filled with admiration. "You really are something else, aren't you?" Mac didn't respond immediately. He simply picked up his scattered fishing gear, his movements calm and unhurried. Finally, he glanced at Gus, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Just a fisherman," he said quietly, slinging his gear over his shoulder. Gus chuckled, shaking his head. "Sure, Mac. Just a fisherman." As Mac walked back toward his cabin, the stars overhead reflected in the still waters of the bay, the night resuming its peaceful rhythm. But for the people of the town and for the bikers who had foolishly underestimated him, the memory of what had happened would linger long after the waves erased the scuff marks from the dock. Mac turned his back to the scattered bikers, his step slow and deliberate. He bent down to gather the last of his nets and tackle box, as if nothing had happened. For a moment, the dock was silent except for the distant hum of engines as a few of the bikers tried to restart their damaged motorcycles. But rage has a way of clouding judgment. The leader, his pride battered more than his body, wasn't finished. His eyes burned with humiliation, and he spat onto the dock, the venom in his voice unmistakable. "You think this is over," he hissed, his voice trembling. He reached for the chain one of his crew had dropped, the rusted links clinking in his hands. "I'm not walking away from this. You hear me, old man?" Mac didn't flinch. Didn't turn around. He simply placed the last piece of his fishing gear in the box, his body language calm but impossibly alert. The leader took a step forward, the chain dragging behind him like a rattlesnake ready to strike. "You're not so tough when you're not sneaking up on people, huh? Let's see what happens when you're face to face with someone who's ready." The locals gasped. Gus, standing nearest to Mac, started to step forward, but a subtle glance from Mac stopped him in his tracks. "Don't," Mac said quietly, his voice just loud enough to carry. The leader lunged, swinging the chain wildly. Mac spun around, his movements fluid and impossibly fast. He sidestepped the attack, catching the chain mid-swing. With a sharp tug, he ripped it from the leader's hands and tossed it into the water with a resounding splash. The leader's momentum carried him forward, and before he could regain his balance, Mac was there. One hand gripped the man's jacket, and with an effortless shove, he sent the leader stumbling backward. The man hit the dock hard, the impact echoing in the still night. Mac knelt beside him, his face close enough that the leader could see the hard edge in his eyes. "Lesson 4, Mac said softly, his tone deadly calm. "You don't get second chances when you pick the wrong fight. This is me being generous. Next time, there won't be a conversation." The leader's bravado shattered completely. His hands shook as he pushed himself up, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. "Go," Mac said, standing and towering over the man. His voice carried a finality that left no room for argument. And this time, the leader obeyed. As the bikers finally limped away, their roars fading into the distance, the townsfolk began to stir. They had seen fights before, plenty of bar brawls and petty disputes, but what they had just witnessed wasn't a fight. It was a dismantling. Gus approached cautiously, his voice filled with a mix of awe and curiosity. "Mac, what was all that? Who are you really?" Mac hesitated. He had spent years building a life away from questions, away from the weight of his past. But there were some things you couldn't hide forever. "I told you, Gus," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm just a fisherman." "Fishermen don't move like that," Gus said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "And they definitely don't have tattoos like that." Mac looked out over the water, the moonlight reflecting off the gentle waves. For a long moment, he didn't speak. When he finally did, his tone was distant, as though he were speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "I served," he admitted, his voice carrying a weight that spoke of years of experience. "A long time ago. But that's behind me now." Gus studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well," he said, clapping Mac on the shoulder, "you've got my respect. Not that you needed to earn it." Mac gave him a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks, Gus." The biker's departure left a quiet unease in the air. The townsfolk, who had grown accustomed to their sleepy routines, couldn't help but wonder if trouble might return. "You think they'll be back?" Gus asked as he and Mac walked toward the bait shop. "Maybe," Mac said simply. "And if they do?" Mac's expression didn't change. "They'll wish they hadn't." The words were delivered with such calm certainty that Gus couldn't help but believe him. In the days that followed, whispers of the incident spread throughout the town. Everyone had their own version of the story, how Mac had single-handedly taken on a gang of bikers, how he moved like a shadow, how he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen and done things most people couldn't imagine. But Mac stayed the same. He still rose early to take his boat out to the bay. He still greeted the locals with a polite nod and a quiet smile. And he still avoided unnecessary conversations. For the townsfolk, however, Mac was no longer just the quiet fisherman. He was something more, a guardian, perhaps, or a reminder that even in the quietest places, Strength could be found in unexpected forms. Word of the incident didn't just stay in the harbor town. It reached neighboring communities, and even the bikers themselves seemed to spread the story, though their version was undoubtedly skewed. "Some crazy old man took us out," one of them muttered at a bar in the next town over. "Didn't even break a sweat. Guy's not normal." "You're saying he's military?" someone else asked, disbelief evident in their tone. The biker nodded grimly. "Not just military. Navy SEAL." The room went quiet. "So what are you gonna do about it?" The biker laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "What do you think? We're not going back there, that's for damn sure." Back in the harbor, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an event. Mac continued to live his quiet life, the past fading once again into the background. But every so often, when he looked out over the water, he couldn't help but feel the ripple effects of that night. It wasn't regret. It wasn't satisfaction, either. It was something else, a reminder that no matter how far you tried to run, some parts of you would always stay. And for Mac, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The scene at the dock was one that would be etched into the memory of the small harbor town forever. As the bikers limped away, bruised and humiliated, they cast nervous glances back at Mac, their leader's curses muffled by the sounds of engines sputtering to life. Mac stood motionless, his calm, unreadable expression a stark contrast to the chaos they left in their wake. The crowd of townsfolk had grown, whispers turned to cheers, and hesitant clapping evolved into a round of applause that rippled across the dock. Gus, ever the town's loudest voice, took the lead. "Mac, you showed 'em. You're a hero," he hollered, grinning wide. Mac glanced at Gus, his brow slightly furrowed. "I'm no hero," he said simply, brushing his hands on his weather jeans. His tone was steady, unassuming. To Mac, the events that had just unfolded were no cause for celebration. As the crowd closed in around him, Mac felt their questions before they even reached his ears. "Where'd you learn to fight like that, Mac?" one of the young dockhands asked, eyes wide with curiosity. "How'd you take down 5 of 'em so fast?" another chimed in, clutching his fishing pole like it was a sword. "Mac, why didn't you ever tell us you were military?" an elderly woman from the bakery asked, clutching her scarf as if it might blow away in the rising wind. Mac held up his hand, silencing the flurry of voices. "I'm just a fisherman," he said again, his tone calm but resolute. "What happened here, let's keep it between us." Gus frowned, scratching the back of his head. "You sure about that, Mac? Folks ought to know there's someone around here who can protect this place." Mac shook his head. "If people know, trouble will come looking. I don't want that for me or for the town." The crowd nodded slowly, understanding dawning across their faces. Whatever Mac's past was, it was clear he valued his privacy. And they respected him enough to honor it. The bikers' humiliation didn't end when they roared out of town. Word of their defeat spread quickly. The tough, leather-clad crew who had once terrorized small towns along the coast suddenly found their reputation in tatters. In the next town over, one of the bikers sat nursing a black eye at a dive bar. "You hear what happened to Red and his gang?" a patron asked, sliding into the stool beside him. The biker scowled, staring into his beer. "Yeah, I heard," he muttered. "That old fisherman." The patron chuckled. "Took down all of you. Must have been something to see." "Ain't nothing funny about it," the biker snapped, slamming his glass on the counter. "Guy moved like a ghost. We didn't stand a chance." The patron raised an eyebrow. "So what now? You going back there?" The biker's face paled. He shook his head vehemently. "Hell no. That guy ain't normal. We're staying clear of that town." Back in the harbor, the townsfolk noticed the change almost immediately. Travelers who passed through spoke in hushed tones about the crazy old fisherman who had scared off one of the meanest biker gangs on the coast. For once, the small harbor town felt safe. Life returned to its slow, peaceful rhythm, but the air around Mac seemed different. People greeted him with a new respect, their tones warmer, their smiles brighter. At the bait shop, old man Harlan, who rarely spoke more than a grunt, offered Mac a firm handshake. "You done good, Mac," he said, his voice gruff. Mac nodded in acknowledgement, but his mind was already elsewhere. The fight had stirred something in him, a faint echo of his past, one he had worked hard to leave behind. As the days passed, Mac found solace in the same routines he had followed for years. Each morning, he rowed his small boat into the bay, the sound of the waves lapping against the hull calming his thoughts. He focused on his nets, the rhythm of his work grounding him in the present. But even as he tried to move on, the town's gratitude followed him. Someone left a fresh loaf of bread on his doorstep one morning. Another day, a group of kids waved at him excitedly from the dock, calling out, "Thanks, Mac," as he returned with his catch. Mac accepted these gestures quietly, but he never lingered in conversations. He wasn't looking for recognition. He just wanted peace. The biker leader, Red, couldn't let go of his humiliation. Weeks passed, and though his crew had long since decided to steer clear of Mac's town, Red nursed his bitterness like a wound that wouldn't heal. One night, he found himself in a seedy bar, ranting to anyone who would listen. "He's just a fisherman," he growled, slamming his fist on the table. "No one humiliates me like that and gets away with it." A man in the corner of the bar raised an eyebrow. He wore a faded military jacket and had the air of someone who had seen too much. "A fisherman, huh?" the man drawled. "With a trident tattoo? Sounds like you picked a fight with a seal." Red froze. "A seal," he repeated, his voice faltering. The man nodded. "Yeah. You're lucky you walked away. Seals don't mess around. They're trained to handle way worse than you." The realization hit Red like a freight train. The man he had underestimated wasn't just a tough old fisherman, he was someone who had spent years training to be the best of the best. Red left the bar that night a quieter man. Whatever revenge he had dreamed of suddenly seemed like a very bad idea. Months passed, and the memory of the fight began to fade. The harbor town slipped back into its quiet, predictable rhythms. Tourists came and went, and the locals continued their routines. But Mac remained a figure of quiet strength. For the townsfolk, knowing he was there brought a sense of security they hadn't realized they needed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the bay in shades of gold and orange, Mac sat on the dock, mending his nets. Gus joined him, a beer in hand. "You ever think about what you did, Mac?" Gus asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Mac didn't look up. "Not much to think about," he said. "Well, I do," Gus said. "You stood up for this town. For people who couldn't stand up for themselves. That matters." Mac glanced at Gus, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Maybe," he said. As the waves lapped against the dock and the stars began to appear in the night sky, Mac felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done what needed to be done, and for now, that was enough. For the harbor town, Mac was more than just a fisherman. He was their protector, their quiet hero. And though he would never admit it, he wouldn't have it any other way. The harbor town settled back into its rhythm, as if nothing had happened. The fishermen returned to their nets, the shopkeepers to their counters, and the children to their games. Life went on, as it always did. But there was an unspoken shift in the air. People walked a little taller, spoke a little softer, and treated each other with more respect. In the days that followed, the memory of the bikers' defeat faded, but the quiet strength of the fisherman, Mac, lingered. It wasn't just the bikers who had learned something that day, it was the entire town. They had learned a powerful truth. A truth that often gets lost in the noise of the world. Sometimes, strength isn't about how loud you are, it's about knowing when to act. Most people assume that power is measured by how big you are, how much you can shout, how many people follow you. They think that to be strong, you have to be the center of attention, to dominate, to make others fear you. But Mac had shown them all something different. He hadn't needed to shout. He hadn't needed to put on a show of force. When the moment came, he acted with purpose, precision, and quiet confidence. That was all it took. In a world that often glorifies noise and spectacle, Mac's actions were a reminder that true power doesn't need to boast. It doesn't need to scream or fight for attention. True power is silent, subtle, and sure. It's knowing that when the time comes, you're ready to face whatever stands before you, no matter how big or intimidating it may seem. For Mac, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. He didn't care about the praise or the recognition. He wasn't looking for admiration. He just wanted to live his life, to fish, to keep the peace. But when push came to shove, when the people he cared about were threatened, he acted. And in that quiet action, he showed everyone what real strength looked like. There's a lesson in Mac's story for all of us. We don't have to be loud or forceful to make an impact. Sometimes, the most powerful moments come in the silence between words, in the calm before the storm, in the simple decision to do what's right, even when no one is watching. True strength doesn't need to be announced, it speaks for itself. As the bikers left town, tails between their legs, the respect they had once held for themselves now shattered, they carried with them the knowledge of their defeat. They weren't just beaten by a fisherman, they had been outclassed by someone who had nothing to prove, yet everything to teach. And as for Mac, he returned to his boat the next morning, his focus back on his nets. The sun rose over the harbor, casting a golden glow over the water. The town was at peace again, and that was enough for him. He had done what needed to be done, and in the end, that was all anyone could ask of him. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the most power. And those who judge by appearances, they're the ones who never see it coming. There's a quiet strength in every one of us. It doesn't come from how loud we can shout or how much attention we can draw. It comes from knowing who we are, what we stand for, and having the courage to act when it matters most. So, the next time you find yourself facing a challenge, no matter how big or small, remember Mac. Remember that the loudest roar isn't always the most powerful. The true strength is in knowing when to stand firm and when to stay silent. In knowing when to act, and when to let your actions speak louder than words. True power is quiet, but it's unshakable. And it's always ready when you need it most.